The sky over Marin, France, is a sheet of burning metal. August 13th, 1944, 14:06 hours. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt tears through the haze above Argentan, chasing a column of German armor retreating south. The pilot, Lieutenant Tom Keane, has 20 seconds of ammunition left. He rolls, dives, pulls up, and finds himself face to face with an FW-190 coming head-on. The German opens fire first. Orange tracers cut the air between them like a zipper made of fire. Keane's hand slams the trigger. The nose of his Thunderbolt glows white. 8 .50 caliber guns roar in unison. And in that instant, both men know they're out of room. 400 miles per hour. 400 miles per hour. 800 miles per hour of closing speed. There's no time to dodge, no time to pray. They hit. Not wing to wing, but close enough that the German's right cannon shell clips the outer edge of Keane's propeller. The entire P-47 shudders. A scream of metal fills the cockpit. The prop should have torn apart. Every pilot knows this. When a prop blade bends at that speed, it snaps the crankshaft, rips the engine off its mounts, and turns the aircraft into a flaming hammer. But somehow, it doesn't. Keane's vision blurs. Smoke, oil, vibration. The propeller looks wrong. It's bent, twisted like a spoon left in fire. Yet it's still spinning. The engine coughs, then roars again. He limps home on a dying engine across 40 miles of sky, landing gear half jammed. The ground crew runs out expecting a funeral. Instead, he's alive. And in the weeks ahead, what they'll discover about that bent propeller will change how American planes survive head-on attacks. But before we get there, we need to understand why men like Keane were dying faster than anyone could replace them. It started as a numbers problem and ended as a human tragedy. By the summer of '44, the Luftwaffe couldn't win the air war straight up, so they changed tactics. Instead of dogfights, they charged straight at the bombers and escorts, guns blazing, forcing Americans into suicidal head-on collisions. A Thunderbolt was built like a brick, a flying tank wrapped around an engine. But no armor in the world could stop physics. A head-on pass meant a closing speed of nearly 700 to 800 miles per hour, and even a pebble-sized piece of shrapnel could unbalance the propeller. When that happened, centrifugal force would rip the engine apart. Pilots described it as a sledgehammer hitting the nose. The plane would tumble, catch fire, or break in two before the pilot could even bail out. In July alone, the 8th Air Force lost 112 P-47s. More than a third of them weren't shot down. They simply failed mid-air after taking damage. One of them was Captain Don Weller. He radioed, "I'm hit, engine's gone," before his voice cut off in a burst of static. His wingman saw the Thunderbolt fold in half and disappear into a French wheat field. Another was Sergeant Harold Knox, a farm boy from Iowa who'd volunteered to be a ferry pilot. His wreck was found 10 miles from base, nose buried deep, the propeller snapped clean at the hub. They said it looked like someone had twisted the blades with God's own pliers. For every one man who made it back with a damaged prop, 3 didn't. And the rules made it worse. Each propeller was a Hamilton standard 13-foot aluminum blade, perfectly balanced, manufactured to tight tolerances. Crews were forbidden to reshape, bend, or heat treat them in the field. No field adjustments under any circumstances. Those were the orders stamped on the maintenance manuals in red ink. If a propeller tip was bent even slightly, it was tagged unserviceable, scrap metal. But in war, unserviceable often meant you die waiting for replacements. Pilots joked that the paperwork would outlive them. Beneath the humor, they were angry. They were watching friends die not because the enemy was better, but because the system couldn't bend.
In the corner of Hangar 3B at RAF Boxstead, Essex, one man had stopped laughing. Sergeant Joe Lasky, 24 years old, a prop mechanic, not an officer, not an engineer, just a grease-stained kid from Newark, New Jersey, who grew up fixing tractors and engines on his uncle's farm. Every day he worked beside the boneyard, a line of broken P-47 propellers leaning against the wall like crosses in a cemetery. He'd lost 3 friends that month. He remembered the sound of the radio calls, the flat crack of an engine tearing off its mount, the smell of hot oil and wet grass after a crash. And then one afternoon, while sorting damaged blades, he noticed something strange. Some of the bad propellers, the ones pilots brought back from near misses, weren't shattered. Their tips were slightly bent, curved just enough to catch the light differently. Yet those blades had survived direct hits. He ran his fingers along the metal, tracing the curve. The steel felt springy, alive. A thought he couldn't shake. What if that bend saved them? It didn't make sense. Every manual said balance was life. A perfect blade was safe. A bent one was death. But what if the truth was the opposite? What if the flexibility, that little bit of imperfection, absorbed the shock instead of snapping? Lasky tried telling his supervisor. The man laughed him off. "You planning to redesign Hamilton Standard in a barn, Sergeant?" But that night he stayed late, sitting under a flickering bulb, staring at the mangled prop of a downed Thunderbolt. He whispered, "They die flying by the book. Maybe it's time the book got bent too." Rain hammered the roof. The hangar smelled like oil and cold coffee. Lasky dragged a 13-foot prop blade onto a wooden stand. He looked over his shoulder. Empty. He wasn't supposed to be here after hours. He set the torch to low flame. The metal glowed dull orange. He worked slow, sweating, cautious, the way you'd touch something sacred. He used a measuring tape, chalk marks, and an old carpenter's mallet. Every hit echoed like thunder inside the hangar. Each tap was a risk, a possible court-martial. He bent the leading edge by 3/4 of an inch, then cooled it with an oily rag, steam rising like smoke from a battlefield. His hands shook. He knew if this thing failed, a pilot would die because of him. But if it worked, maybe a few wouldn't. He sanded the surface, wiped it clean, and stared at his reflection in the dull aluminum curve. Then he did the unthinkable. He forged an inspection tag with another man's initials. He attached it to the modified propeller, marked it, cleared for flight, and loaded it onto a maintenance rack for morning installation. As the lights went out, he muttered, "Let's see if imperfection can keep someone alive." Morning broke cold and colorless over Boxstead Airfield. Engines coughed to life in the mist. Crews moved like ghosts between the hulking P-47s, their breath mixing with the smoke. Lasky barely looked up when Lieutenant Tom Keene strolled over, coffee in hand, calling, "Hey, Joe, you fixed my girl yet?" Joe's stomach tightened. That girl was little Annie, the same Thunderbolt he'd secretly fitted with the bent propeller the night before. He forced a grin.
Good.
"All squared away, Lieutenant. She'll fly true."
I'm blaming you.
Keene clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, because if she doesn't, I'm blaming you personally." The words were a joke, but they landed like a threat. Minutes later, little Annie rolled down the runway. The ground shook as her 4-bladed prop blurred into silver. Lasky watched the takeoff, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He told himself the bend was invisible. He told himself the numbers worked. He didn't believe either. 30 minutes later, over the Ardennes, Keen's squadron was flying low, strafing a German convoy retreating along a narrow forest road. The Thunderbolts dropped down like hammers, ripping apart trucks and flak wagons. Then someone shouted over the radio, "Bandits, 11 o'clock high!" FW-190s, fast, vicious, diving head-on. Keen hauled the stick back, throttle to the wall, his canopy filled with black crosses and muzzle flashes. Bullets slashed across the nose of Little Annie. One round struck dead center, punching through the propeller's edge. The plane jerked sideways. A sound like a car crash exploded through the cockpit. Keen's first thought, "Prop's gone. I'm dead." But it didn't tear apart. The Thunderbolt kept flying, shaking like a beast in chains, but still alive. He squeezed the trigger. 8 guns spat fire. One FW-190 rolled under him, trailing smoke. "Jesus, engine's vibrating like hell," he yelled into the mic. "I'm hit, but she's holding." "Say again?" another voice crackled. "I said she's holding." He pulled up through cloud, leveled off and limped west toward base. The prop bent, vibrating, whining like an angry hornet. Fuel leaking, oil pressure dropping. 43 miles to home. Every minute felt like an hour. He landed hard, wheels bouncing once, twice, then screeching to a stop. Crewmen ran toward him, waving and shouting. When the prop stopped spinning, they stared. The blade was twisted at the tip, not destroyed, just warped. "How the hell?" someone muttered. Lasky stood frozen at the edge of the runway, heart hammering in his throat. Keen climbed down, face gray with exhaustion, and barked a laugh. "Tell your boys in the prop shop they built a miracle." Lasky didn't answer. He just nodded and turned away, hands trembling. That night, the hangar lights burned late again. Mechanics gathered around Little Annie's bent prop, whispering like men around a forbidden relic. They measured, they tapped the metal, they argued. One of them finally said it. "That curve." She flexed instead of snapping. Someone else asked, "You think it was luck?" Lasky shook his head slowly. No such thing as luck at 400 miles an hour. Word spread fast. 2 days later, a crew chief from another squadron showed up asking, "Hey, what's this about a shock bend prop that won't tear off?" Lasky tried to deny it. Too late. They'd already heard. Within a week, more than a dozen Thunderbolts at Boxted flew with blades adjusted in the same way. Tiny, invisible curves along the tips, done after hours by men who pretended they were fixing scratches. And they started noticing something strange. The fatal vibrations stopped. Engines that should have torn themselves apart after hits came home rattling but intact. They started calling them Lasky blades. By late September, the stats spoke for themselves. Before the modification, 1 in 3 P-47s hit in the nose didn't make it home. After, it dropped to 1 in 10. Pilots started betting cigarettes that their bent girls could take a head-on hit and live. Nobody officially knew why. Nobody officially wanted to ask. But numbers didn't lie. On the other side of the sky, the Germans noticed, too. FW-190 pilots began reporting that Thunderbolts weren't breaking up anymore. "They take the hits and keep coming," one ace wrote in his diary. "It's like shooting at anvils." The Luftwaffe tried adjusting tactics again, diving from higher altitude, using ramming angles steeper than 40 degrees. But it was too late. The Americans had found their resilience. From the outside, it looked like luck. From inside the hangars, men knew better. The trick was spreading faster than anyone could trace. Crews whispered it during mess breaks, passed it on between smoke shifts. Just half an inch, maybe 3/4, enough to let it flex. They did it with torches, hammers, wrenches, whatever they had. No paperwork, no orders. The same system that once punished them for touching a propeller was now saved by the quiet defiance of the men who did. Back in Boxted, Lasky kept his head down.
Every time a modified P-47 returned, scorched but flying, he marked a tally inside his locker door. By October, there were 21 men alive because of something no one would ever officially admit existed. Still, the risk was constant. When a visiting colonel from Maintenance Command inspected the hangars, mechanics had to straighten every blade, polish away hammer marks, pretend perfection. Lasky held his breath as the colonel stopped beside little Annie, running a gloved finger along the prop tip. "Looks within tolerance," the colonel said finally. "Keep it that way." When he left, the whole shop exhaled. Then someone started laughing. Quiet at first, then louder, like men laughing after a funeral that never happened. By winter, the skies over Europe belonged to the Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe's head-on attacks faded. Pilots said it wasn't worth it anymore. The Americans don't break. Lasky's little field experiment had spread across 2 fighter groups, then the entire 56th Fighter Wing. The engineering division back in the States quietly issued a technical bulletin. Field curvature adjustments permissible within tolerance range, provided symmetry maintained. No one mentioned where the idea came from. No signature, no commendation. But every prop that left the depot carried a fraction of his bend. A whisper of rebellion baked into official procedure. For the men in the air, the difference was everything. Now they could go head-on with a 190 and live to tell about it. For the men on the ground, it was validation, proof that sometimes bending the rules saved more lives than following it. And for Lasky, it was a secret he carried alone. He'd walk the flight line at dusk, watching propellers glint in the setting sun, each one spinning his invisible curve. Sometimes he'd smile. Sometimes he'd look like he'd seen a ghost, because for every plane that came home, he still remembered the ones that didn't. The sound of the crash, the smell of burning oil, the empty bunk across from his. He'd traded fear for survival, but the guilt stayed. The war was ending, but no one at Boxted Airfield dared celebrate yet. The sky was quieter. The bulletin boards showed fewer black X's beside pilot names. And in the prop shop, Sergeant Joe Lasky was finally sleeping more than 3 hours at a time. One evening, he sat alone outside the hangar door. The sun was sinking over the airfield, turning the wet tarmac into a mirror of orange light. The sound of distant engines faded like thunder after a storm. He lit a cigarette, watched the smoke twist upward, and listened to the silence. That strange, heavy silence that only comes after too much noise. He'd spent 2 years fighting death with a wrench and a hammer, and now with victory in sight, he wondered if anyone would ever know. A few weeks later, VE Day came. The base erupted. Pilots fired flare pistols into the air, dancing on the wings of their planes. Champagne bottles cracked open. Someone painted "Home Soon" on the side of a truck. Lasky stood off to the side, smiling but distant. A pilot slapped him on the back and shouted, "You're the man who kept us alive, Joe." He shrugged. "Nah, just did my job." But deep down, he knew what that meant. When the deactivation orders came through, Lasky packed his tools in a battered duffel. 1 pair of gloves, 2 screwdrivers, 1 mallet, the same one he'd used to bend the first blade. He paused in front of little Annie, the Thunderbolt that had proven his gamble right. The propeller still bore a faint ripple along one tip, the mark no amount of polish could hide. He ran his hand over it, feeling the cool metal under his palm. The war had burned everything. Friends, time, innocence. But this piece of curved aluminum had fought back. He whispered, "Thanks for holding together." Then he turned and walked away.
When he got back to Newark, the world didn't look the same.
There were parades and flags, but no medals waiting for mechanics. He tried working in a garage, but every time a wrench clinked against metal, he heard the sound of hammering in that box-dead hangar. He wrote once to his old unit asking if anyone had filed reports on modified propellers, but the reply never came. And that was it. No record, no recognition, no citation. Just a rumor, a whisper that somewhere in England, a sergeant had figured out how to make a propeller survive the impossible. The rumor faded, but the design didn't. By the early 1950s, when civilian engineers re-examined the P-47's post-war performance data, they noticed something odd. Late-war blades showed microscopic warping patterns near the tips, deliberate, symmetrical, manufactured directly into the metal. One internal memo from Hamilton Standard called it adaptive tip curvature. No one explained where the idea came from. It simply appeared. But anyone who'd been there in '44 would have recognized that curve instantly. It was Lasky's bend. Years later, restorers rebuilding Thunderbolts at museums noticed the same thing. A slight ripple along the leading edge, barely visible unless the light hit just right. They'd sand it, polish it, and wonder aloud, must have been a field fix. They never knew the name behind it. If you go to Duxford Air Museum today and stand close to the restored P-47 Sweet Lorraine, you can still see it. That tiny asymmetry, like a scar on perfection. Visitors walk past it every day without noticing. But that curve once meant the difference between coming home and vanishing into a cloud of fire. Joe Lasky never told anyone. He married, had 2 kids, worked 30 years as a factory mechanic. His hands stayed calloused, his tools clean. He fixed toasters, engines, tractors, anything that broke. And sometimes, when a neighbor thanked him, he'd just nod and say, "Things run better when they can bend a little." That was all he ever said about the war. He died in 1983. The obituary mentioned his service at Boxted, but not what he'd done there. No one knew to ask. His hammer, the same one from the hangar, was found in his garage, head worn smooth, initials JL carved into the handle. History tends to remember the big names, the generals, the aces, the inventors, but most of what really changed wars came from hands like his. Quiet, tired, uncelebrated hands. When the manuals said never, he said maybe. When the system froze, he bent it, literally. He wasn't a hero in uniform. He was a man who looked at the sky full of fire and decided that metal, like men, shouldn't have to be perfect to survive. And because of that, dozens, maybe hundreds of pilots came home who otherwise wouldn't have. The official reports called it an incremental material tolerance adjustment. But we know what it really was. A hammer, a torch, a risk, and one mechanic who couldn't stand another empty bunk. He broke the rules. The rules broke the enemy. And history forgot his name. The sound of a P-47 engine starting in the distance, a low, guttural rumble. Camera pans across an airfield at dawn. The propeller spins once, twice, catching the first light of sunrise, that faint bend glinting like a secret. If you ever see one of these old birds at an air show, look close at the blades. That little curve at the tip, that's a man's fingerprint on history. And now, you're one of the few who know whose it was. If this story hit you the way it hit us, tap like so more people hear it. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Our audience runs from small-town mechanics to history teachers. And make sure you're subscribed so these names don't disappear.